I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Dutloff.
All right, folks, this week we're letting it all hang out. We've got a really unstructured kind of seat of the pants episode we're doing, and it's going to be great just the same. We're kind of getting back to the basics of the podcast where Dean and I do just talk about something for about 40 minutes. It's going to be great. You're going to love it. Before we get there, though, I do need to tell you about something really exciting, dear listeners, and it is this. If you like our podcast, you can go support us at patreon.com/themagnificast. You can give us a little bit of your money, a little bit of that Das Capital that you got in your wallet, and you can support us. You get the satisfaction of knowing that your money is going to go to keeping us doing this podcast for just a little bit longer. In exchange, you get all kinds of other fun things like maybe a sticker. You get access to early episodes when they come out, which is sometimes and not all the time. And also you get access to the behind the paywall Discord channel, and that's pretty cool. We actually just started this past week having a discussion group where we read an essay from the monthly review and we talk about it. So this past week, a few of us got together and we talked about China, which was great. I think that I didn't bring much to the conversation, but other folks did. It was a really good time. So that could be you. You could be a part of that. So just go to our Patreon and maybe give us some money. And if you don't want to, that's fine. It's no big deal. You can also just leave us a little nice review on iTunes, a little 5 out of 5 stars. That'd be great.
Yeah, there's also a podcast behind the paywall that we do if you don't get enough of us in this part of your life called The Lock-In, where we do Reddit goofs and talk about current events and expand on some stuff that we do in the podcast and so on. It's a little more chill. I guess it's more like the vibe of this episode right here where we're just figuring it out as we go. So if that's something you want to pay for, you can. But I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. It would be great, though, if you did give us one of those reviews. Okay, that's enough of that commercial. I'm tired of it. Let's move on to the real content, the substance, why the people are tuning in to this one. And Matt and I were trying to figure out what to do this week. We had some plans. They fell through. And we were DMing, and we decided, you know what, something we've been talking about a lot just together, not on this podcast, is the problem of true Christianity, what people think that is, and Christian socialism. And Matt and I both came to the sort of vague conclusion that we actually don't know how to feel about some of it. So I guess we're going to figure it out in the next 40 minutes or so, and we'll invite you all to figure out how you feel about it with us as well. Does that seem like a good entree into this, Matt? Is that where we're heading? Yeah,
I think so. We're going to get to the bottom of the various appeals to what is and what is not true Christianity. We might solve it. We also might, we'll open up a new plateau. We'll open up a new line of inquiry. This is a way of talking that people teach you in grad school. And if you're not a grad school goer, that's okay. But this is a way that you can sound smart when you really don't know the answer to something. Yeah, just a great line of questioning to open up on this. And I'll consider that for further research. But this time we mean it because we're a podcast. So we don't have the ability to just kind of put this on the back burner. So, yeah, I think it'll be an interesting conversation. At least we've talked around this a few different times and said some things about it, but I think to tackle it head on is a lot. So we'll see where we get to by the end of the episode. Well, let's start off here. Uh, I'll do my best to state the problem, and then we can see if we can figure this one out. So when it comes to politics and Christianity, there is a tendency for people who are on the left, who are socialists, who are liberals, even, and people who are on the right. You know, all the other people, the two camps here. There's a tendency for people on the left and the right to treat like their particular politics as an obvious result of like one Bible passage or another, right? You know, they read the Bible, they understood, you know, something about it, and they've derived an important political point for them from that Bible passage. For example, folks on the right will read a handful of verses from the Old Testament or whatever, and conjure up a whole regime of persecution for LGBTQ people, right? And like that becomes the core of what it means to be a Christian to them and engaged in politics. And on the other hand, people on the left will read a story about Jesus's miraculous healing and whatever, and that's actually support for Medicare for all specifically. And Jesus is a socialist, right? That's like what people rush to. So in both these cases, I think it's pretty interesting, but in both these cases, folks will engage in deeply complex interpretive projects to support their politics, all the while insisting that what they've actually got is simple and clearly stated, and you know, it's just what Jesus is all about. So people, I guess the rub here is that people will derive a whole lot of political meaning from something that has not a lot of political meaning, and they will try to present that as something as clear. All right, does that make sense, Dean? Is what I'm saying coherent?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's what's so hard about it. The problem, you know, we've talked about this at length on the show too, but I think there's a time in both of our lives where we would have been in this same boat, right? You read the Bible doesn't like things like, I don't know, kings. It doesn't like things like violence in some cases. In other cases, it likes it a lot, but in some cases. And so you kind of derive this left-wing sort of Christian anarchist stance, for instance, from what you think is kind of the pulse of the biblical story. And I do think there's a lot of productive things about that. Maybe in a more serious way, you might think of somebody like, the person that always comes to mind for me is James Cone, right? Like, there's a really powerful argument that he puts forward in God of the Oppressed, where he argues that true Christianity is the anti-racist one. It's the Christianity of Black Christianity. And white Christianity, the oppressive one, the racist one, is just not right. It's heretical. It's not the true one. It's a fake version. Mm-hmm. And it's rhetorically extremely powerful, very effective, and it catches me off guard. It makes me want to say I'm a Christian, right, when you read it. But at the same time, I do think you kind of lose something by reducing the stakes of Christianity perhaps to those that kind of binary, even though it's really rhetorically effective, politically effective perhaps too. So anyway, we'll have to parse that out together as we go. But I think it's a really interesting problem to think through, having been through that problem in a different sort of way.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the James Cone example is so good because, just like you said, it makes you want to be a Christian. Like, I agree with James Cone, and like what he's saying I think is probably true. At the same time, you have to recognize that like a whole lot of other Christians have read exactly the opposite, you know? Mm-hmm. And like you could just say that all other Christians are actually heretics who have read, the Bible in favor of white supremacy or something. And I think that would be letting them all off the hook too easily. You can't really take seriously what Christians have actually done in the name of white supremacy if you just say they're not really Christians, because that erases a lot of things and ends up being problematic in some ways we'll probably talk about. So all of that to say, you can take it from these two evangelical college-going Bible boys. Reading the Bible is actually a really hard thing to do. And treating it as something that's like simple, that you can just say, well, this supports Medicare for all, or this supports nonviolent direct action, or this supports free enterprise, or whatever, is difficult. It's a project that you're building yourself, I guess. Mm-hmm. Is what I'm trying to say, rather than being like a simple meaning that's just in the text, right? In this episode, we're going to take a look at some of the rhetoric that arises around these sorts of stories, whether on the left or the right. We're going to take a look at the rhetoric around like true Christianity and politics. Like, how does this work out in the case of James Cone or from someone on the right? And it's all pretty complicated, but I think it's a really important question to answer. Um, the thing that kind of always I struggle with about it, I suppose, is just that like the rhetoric, at least on the left, like from someone like James Cone, or I'm going to talk about Reverend Barber here in a second. I think it's like really powerful, and it's like something that I think is like can actually be a really, I don't know, important force for like organizing. But rhetoric doesn't necessarily mean philosophy, or doesn't mean like a systematic way of looking at something. So it becomes quite complicated.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the challenge, I think, in this whole conversation, and one that we'll have to figure out slowly. But the challenge of parsing out what's rhetorically useful and what is maybe analytically true, or what do you gain by having those rhetorical interventions, and what do you lose by overcomplicating them? Like all those things are real problems. Like, undeniably, it makes a big difference if you can convince somebody that, yes, the sort of consequence of being a Christian, the things that identity commits you to, are actually socialism, right? Like that's a really compelling thing, and it moves a lot of people in the right direction. It moved me in the right direction. So I have some time for it. But yeah, the question is, what also do you kind of cover over or fail to notice? Or how does your analytical frame of reference maybe get a little bit smaller if you adopt that rhetoric as a way of understanding the totality of what it means to talk about true Christianity or something like that? So yeah, I don't know. We'll figure it out. Parsing out the rhetoric and the kind of analytical lens, I think, is going to be a fun challenge to sort through together.
That's right. Well, we're about 12 minutes in here, and so far we've made a lot of promises about how we're going to figure this one out, and I'm not so sure, but we're going to get somewhere, certainly. Okay. I think maybe if you're not tracking so far, don't be afraid. I think what we've said is kind of heady, and we'll probably break it down a little bit more. So I'm going to give 2 examples that might shed some more light on what we're talking about. And it might take a minute to get through these examples because at least one of them is quite lengthy and one of them is just extremely funny. And I'm going to have to laugh a lot as I get through it. Okay, so here's the first example I think that will kind of help illustrate the problem, and we can kind of talk through it. So Reverend William Barber II, he is one of the co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign. If you don't know about it, it's like basically a broad advocacy group for the rights of poor people. It's progressive, it's good. I mean, honestly, no problems with it. Reverend Barber is someone I think I like pretty deeply respect as a person and an activist. He is like literally out there saying all the things that often need to be said. He's not a socialist, which well, I mean, maybe he is, maybe he isn't. He doesn't quite talk about politics in those terms, which I think is something very interesting, and something we'll have to wade through here in this conversation too. But just the same, he's good. Okay. I don't think I actually have any real criticisms of what like the Poor People's Campaign is about, or like William Barber. I think he's like good. That's all I'm trying to say. It's my big disclaimer that he's a good person. I think what he says is good. Okay, I've said it. There we go. There's a quote that I found that is from an interview he did in 2020, and I think the quote is like, it's not like outstanding in any way. It's just, I think, basically like kind of on brand. It's on his message. It's the way he's always talking about things when it comes to Christianity and justice. So I thought I'd pour it out as just kind of like a good example. So in the interview, his interviewer, he asks Reverend Barber just basically about like what he thinks about like right-wing Christians and why they're more concerned about like Israel than like justice in the United States or something, right? And I'm going to read a little bit of what Barber's response was here. It's a little bit lengthy, so deal with it, listener. He says this: let's look at Jesus' political theology. When Jesus preached his first sermon, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." That's Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he hath anointed me to preach the good news to the poor." And the poor were those who had been victimized by economic exploitation. And the good news was healing to the brokenhearted, recovery of sight to the blind, liberty to the oppressed. And then he goes on to say, "For me, the teaching of Jesus is the highest. I don't claim to be preaching the left gospel or the right gospel, or living out the left gospel or the right gospel. It's just the gospel. And the gospel is clear that there's no separation between Jesus and justice. And there's no separation between Jesus and caring about the least of these and challenging the systems, whether that system is racism or economic exploitation or ecological devastation or the war economy or false religion or nationalism. The gospel is a critique of all of it." Okay. So on the one hand, I affirm and agree with Reverend Barber's reading of Jesus and Justice. That's the one that I like particularly. I think it's good. I'm here for it, for sure. But where we might differ is that there's no left or right gospel. So this is the particular orientation that Barber has here is, I feel bad saying just his last name, Reverend Barber. I feel like he commands a you know, more respect than that.
Yeah.
So I think like the way that Reverend Barber has framed this is that first, you know, if there's a hierarchy of like concerns or obligations he has, the gospel's at the top, right? And then politics is under that probably somewhere, maybe even down further, who knows? And that's what he means when he says that there's no left or right gospel, that it's just the gospel. It's just, you know, he thinks it's the Bible at the very top. And I feel less convinced of that. I don't find that particular claim very convincing. Not because what I think he's saying about the gospel is different from my own experience or what I think is true necessarily, but because there's like 2,000 plus years of Christians who were also reading the same gospel that came to like very different conclusions and like, you know, found a whole lot of reasons to crush people and be awful. And to simply say that those people weren't really Christians or that those people weren't really reading the gospel or that they weren't, you know, whatever, they weren't believing the right way. I feel like that gives people too easy a way out, right? So if Reverend Barber, if what he had was simply the gospel, you know, then why would we still be having this conversation? You know, I think like if you look at the history of Christianity, there are all kinds of, I mean, wildly different movements within it, right? It's not monolithic at all. There's all these different types of Christianities that privilege some types of political action over others and some types of social organization over others. I always think of like Gerard Winstanley and the Diggers, right? Like they are people who are like, we read the Bible, we know what it's all about, we've been to church, and that's why you can't have the land that we're on. It belongs to everybody. Private property's bad or whatever, you know. And then, but other people who are reading the Bible are like, well, actually, we can enclose upon it if we want to, right? They're two groups of people that are reading the same Bible. Two groups of people who I think are probably, you know, they both think that they're probably pretty faithful. They're not heretics. And yet they're still coming to these different conclusions. And to say like one is simply right and one is simply wrong is just like, well, if Christianity was just done right, then you know, then we'd have no problems or whatever. It's just this constant appeal to like past authority that ends up being cyclically problematic, you know. Does that make sense, Dean?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine a listener listening to that and saying, well, sure, writing all these people off, the bad ones, as not real Christians is you know, maybe a hard thing to do, but maybe not impossible. Maybe you do have to kind of, you know, write all them off. You know, why does the path that leads to destruction and narrow is the way to eternal life or whatever it is that Jesus says? And yeah, sure, lots of people just kind of get it wrong and pervert it and so on. And the key is to find that narrow path and stay on it. But I think to kind of avoid the damage of Christianity and the damage of what's done in the name of true Christianity is also very, that puts you in a kind of ironic way on the path to destruction, insofar as I think we end up kind of repeating a lot of weird Christian assumptions when we assume that we can get out of that bind. At least that's my own experience. I'll just put it in first person language. I ended up repeating and still do repeat lots of Christian violent tendencies when I find myself sort of drifting into a more secure Christian identity or something like that. And I think that is important to kind of stay vigilant about. I always think of this line from Vine Deloria's book, God is Red. He's a liberation theologian, kind of, and then not so much. I don't know. A really important indigenous scholar is the better way to put it. Anyway, in God is Red, which is a critique of Christianity and also a really fascinating indigenous spirituality book. He has this line in there where he's kind of dealing with this objection that, oh, those people weren't real Christians. And he says something to the effect of like, well, they understood themselves to be Christians, but also so did everyone else. Like they built, you know, they named streets after them and they named monuments after them, and everybody who ever got elected to office in the countries that they built happened to be Christian and so on. So it's like at a certain point, the empirical evidence is such that at least as a cultural form, Christianity is not whatever we want it to be, or the kind of aspirational thing that we would like it to be. And I think it's just important to keep that open. And we'll have to find a way to talk about Christianity maybe later on, where we can sort of figure out what it means to talk about it at all. It is important to kind of complicate talking about Christianity in the singular even. But nevertheless, I guess the key is to say what you lose by adopting the Barber strategy, again, understanding that Reverend Barber is extremely cool and very important. What you lose is that attention to the complexities of basically the fact that you do have to take on board everything that Christianity has done, and then you have to sort it through and make a decision about what you want to do moving forward, rather than kind of committing yourself to one piece of it over against all the rest of history or something.
Yeah, that's right. Well, at least maybe one distinction that we can make is that on this podcast, at least, when we're talking about Christianity, we're talking about it materially, I think, is usually the point that we stick to, right? Like, Christianity has a material reality that I think that you have to pay attention to. Christianity is what it does in the world, right? It can also, it also produces a certain set of beliefs that you can accept and kind of put together, but it does have a certain set of material realities with particular possibilities that stem from that. So I guess that maybe is one thing we can articulate about what Christianity is, or at least what we're talking about, right? Like, the Spanish Inquisition is Christianity because, like, Christianity literally did it,
right.
But also so are the Diggers, because Christianity literally did that too. But these are like these are projects of people like fiddling with what they have and seeing like what can kind of come of it, right? And sometimes it's better and sometimes it's worse. And I think that's the thing that I find sort of interesting. Well, we can keep going on that path in a minute, maybe. Let me read another example of this type of like weird appeal to like a simple and obvious Christianity based on just like reading something, but this time from a different perspective. Christians on the right are just as guilty as this kind of thing as people on the left, and probably more so, or maybe just in ways I like less. I don't know. In more absurd ways, for sure. So this one is a pretty big one. So here's an example from our friends at the Acton Institute. Real Magnificast heads will know the Acton Institute from some of our earlier days, the podcast. They are a libertarian Christian think tank, which is, the most opposite as you can think of. It's the perfect foil for this podcast. This is from a blog that was written by some guy named Richard Turnbull. I don't know anything about him, but he wrote a silly blog, so I'm going to tell you about it. So the whole point of the blog is him trying to explain why entrepreneurship is a biblical idea. Which I don't know why you would want to do that, like why that's important, but this is what he's done. So here's a little bit from Richard Turnbull. There are numerous biblical examples of enterprise and entrepreneurship. First,
numerous.
Exodus. Yeah, so many. First, Exodus 35, 30 through 35. The context for this verse is the people of Israel wandering in the desert prior to entering the promised land. Here, detailed instructions are given for the construction of the tabernacle, which will be the focus of worship during this period. Moses points to one individual named Bezalel. Probably saying that wrong, but that's okay. And he says this: Then Moses said to the people of Israel, He has filled him with the Spirit of God and skill, with intelligence and knowledge, and with all the craftsmanship to devise artistic designs, to work in gold and silver and bronze, and cutting stones for setting, and carving wood, for work in every skilled
But
craft.
a busy guy.
So very busy. Yeah. He has filled them with the skill to do every sort of work done by an engraver or by a designer or by an embroiderer in blue and purple and scarlet yarns and fine twined linen, or by weaver and any sort of workman or skilled designer. Man, the Old Testament is just full of stuff.
This is my favorite. My favorite Marvel superhero is Bezalel, the guy who can just make anything.
He can't do anything. He can do the things that engravers do.
Right.
And embroiderers, designers, and weavers. And that's about it. I'm sorry. He can also cut stones. So this is like, okay, hang on. Clearly, Reverend Barber's simple reading of the gospel and just kind of putting it out there is way more compelling.
Yeah.
But this one, just like Reverend Barber's, I feel again kind of bad putting them next to each other, because like one is clearly different and better.
Yeah, of course.
And this one is just like kind of silly. But still, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that but both fail to recognize that they lean on a plain understanding of Scripture that instead of generating political obligations, is actually just bringing political obligations to the Scripture, to the Bible, rather than the other way around. So, like I said, Reverend Barber puts the Bible first, then politics second, and just like that, this like very bizarre conservative guy, he puts the Bible first, and then he and then politics second. But really, what they're doing is the opposite. They actually already have these political obligations, and they're bringing, they're kind of coming to the Bible with them. And I think that's at least how I would put it. I suppose it's more complicated than that, though, because these things intermingle and mix in different ways, right? Like, you might come to the Bible with a certain set of political obligations, and then you end up being pushed further by the Bible in a certain direction. But all I'm trying to say here is that, like, this isn't as simple as like reading a passage and then deriving a direct, obvious meaning about entrepreneurship from it.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I don't know if this is a helpful way in, but my brain just made this connection. But, we talk on the show a lot about this book called The Gospel in Solentiname, but it's been a long time since we mentioned it on the podcast, so I'll mention it now. If you haven't listened to the show or don't know about the book, it's a record of a bunch of people in Solentiname, which is a chain of islands in Nicaragua, getting together and talking about the Bible. And a lot of them come from the peasant class in that particular area. And they're sort of led in these discussions by Ernesto Cardenal, one of our favorite revolutionary priests. And it's a fascinating book to read because what you get is all these people engaging different biblical stories and texts and then kind of interpreting that in light of their own situation. And I love it so much because it's the product of a dialogue. It's not like, and here is the meaning of the text. It's like, well, here is the way that this text is kind of bouncing around in a community of people who are trying to think through their own position. And you get these really productive kind of fits and starts. Like sometimes people agree and disagree with each other. But for example, like there's one part when they're talking about the Magnificat, Mary's song, and somebody at some point says, basically that Mary is a Marxist or, she's a revolutionary socialist kind of person. And someone else is like, well, I don't know about that. And, they have this really interesting conversation. But I think that is such a great and productive thing to do, to just sort of, intentionally bring your politics to the Bible and then see what happens. And put it in dialogue. The Bible can sort of, it doesn't just like neatly fit into your own political categories either. I think it's important to let the text kind of trouble you as well and, make for a kind of live dialogue there. But nevertheless, you're not going to come to the Bible and then find the sort of magic recipe for like how to be a good political actor in the world. You have to sort of engage that thing. And I love that text just because it's such a good demonstration of that happening kind of in real time.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I don't want to like suggest that, I don't know, Reverend Barber is some kind of like bad actor or whatever doing this, because I don't think it's the case. But like, I think that it's really important to parse these specific relationships out and like how we encounter biblical texts and like how do they actually form us and like how are we willing to, accept or reject parts of them, right? Because I mean, despite whatever any evangelical pastor wants you to think, like no one accepts the entire Bible in its entirety because that wouldn't actually make sense. It's not comprehensible in any way to do that, right? Like you always have to kind of take some of it up and spit some of it out and like fine. But like parsing out exactly how that works is really important. I think because otherwise you could think of it too simplistically. And also, I mean, like, okay, neither Dean or I are biblical scholars in the least, and we wouldn't pretend to be. But like, there are ways that you can kind of bring your own assumptions to the text and have these like very fruitful sort of encounters. I think that's totally fine, and like in dialogue or whatever. But also, like, I mean, there's a whole like historical movement of people who are doing the opposite. Like, well, what's happening in the actual culture of the writers of this particular piece of scripture, all this kind of stuff too, where people do like real exegetical work about like the context of these writings too, which is also really good, but like a different conversations yet, it's like another piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's also like, if someone asked me flat out, do I think the Bible has a certain orientation or like a certain, I don't know, pulse to it or something, I guess I would probably say yes. Like I do think that the Bible points in a direction that I think basically you can recognize, I hope, the trajectory of my life in that arrow. You know what I mean? Like, I do not think that the Bible is a treatise about how to build a socialist world, but I think that, it points you in the direction that puts you on the path to then wanting to figure out how to build a socialist world. So it's not like I don't believe some version of that story myself, but maybe talking about Reverend Barber a little more is helpful because, you're right, of course. Reverend Barber is not a bad actor. In fact, he's a good actor. I think he's doing a lot of good stuff in the world. I'm happy that he's out there and doing the things he does. But what sometimes frustrates me about Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign is that the appeal to saying that this is just the gospel, I'm not out here on the left. I don't do the left or right thing. It's like, I can understand the rhetoric. I'm sure it probably convinces a handful of people who are on the fence about something and are genuinely good faith people trying to figure out the world around them. But at the end of the day, like, you just do need to recognize, though, that like the left is doing it better. If you really believe these things, like if you really believe that the gospel is against all this stuff, like economic militarism and exploitation and so on, then like at some point you have to just say, and that's why I believe in socialism explicitly as a thing, and I want to figure that out, even though you're going to lose some of your audience by doing that. And it's why Reverend Barber ends up sharing a stage with like Pete Buttigieg sometimes, and it's like, I don't know, man. It's like, I'm not sure who's really getting something out of this sort of situation. It certainly isn't me, a person trying to I don't know, build some other kind of world. So I don't know. All that to say, it's good. Reverend Barber is good. I think I understand rhetorically what's going on there, but the rhetoric itself actually kind of stops you from following that path that maybe you're going to have to if you want to deliver on those promises.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it does kind of put up a block, right? If you're not willing to say that, if you're not willing to do the interpretive work of like, well, the Bible does have a certain orientation towards justice, which again I think is also true, but again, it's like a part of a thing that you're reading. It's like a part of something that you're doing with the text, and the text is doing back. It's this whole postmodern thing, deconstruction, et cetera, et cetera. That's another episode. But like, to bar yourself from thinking about it, like from bringing your own set of political values and goals to it, I think sells yourself. I mean, like it blocks off possibility in a really weird way, where like you just won't see some opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
There's this one, man, it's such a reach into the past, but I don't know, a while back we did read a book from Juan Segundo about liberation theology. And there's this part somewhere in there. God, again, this is flying by the seat of my pants here, guys. But he was talking about Christians for Socialism in Chile, and he's like, "Well, it's like, isn't it interesting? I guess this probably is not exactly the right quote, but there's a thing called Christians for Socialism, but there's nothing called Christians for Capitalism because there doesn't need to be, right? Because it's already held together as a sort of politics. And if you don't explicitly, do that." Like you're gonna fall into the wrong side. You're gonna be a Christian for capitalism without really realizing it, right? If you're not bringing an actual political analysis to the table, and you're just kind of letting the gospel be the gospel and like leaving it at that, and like leaving politics up to politicians, like that is closing off a whole area of possibility for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, speaking of Segundo, there's also a really good quote that I think we probably talked about on that episode too, but he says, there's no such thing as Christian theology or a Christian interpretation of the gospel message in the absence of a prior political commitment. Only the latter makes the former possible at all. And I think that makes sense to me, right? That like you don't just sort of, well, here's something I used to do as an evangelical. I don't know if you did this too, Matt. It's very embarrassing to admit this, but
okay. I definitely didn't do it then.
Yeah, of course. I did do it, and I would I would take the Bible as a young adolescent person who believed that every word of it was true in a straightforward, literal way, and it all hung together and whatever. I would take that Bible and just sort of open it up and then read a passage and sort of try to divine the secret meaning of that passage for my life, right? Uh-huh. As though just sort of inherent in the text, in every little piece of it is some insight into how I ought to be a person in the world. So sometimes you open that up and your brain is a very powerful projection machine, and you find, I don't know, you find out how to deal with not making the basketball team or whatever it is. But other times you open it up and you're like, well, here I am in the genealogies. I better think really hard about what this means for my life, and I think like there's something really bizarre about that exercise, but it really underlines, I think, Segundo's point that that's an extremely weird thing to do to a book, and it actually will not help you figure out how to be, I don't know, how to cope with not making the basketball team, which, as you can see, I did not make it. So I think, the admission that you have to sort of bring your assumptions to the text and then, of course, let it bounce around within the text and challenge you and so on. But that assumption actually frees you up to be like, all right, I need to figure out what I need to get out of this so that I can actually make it usable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I also, one quick caveat here too, because I hear that one person out there who's really skeptical of what we're saying. And they're like, if you're bringing your own political inclinations to the text or whatever, then are you saying that the text doesn't mean anything? You just have to read things into it, and no, that's not what I'm saying. Like, what I am saying though is that the Bible's a really old bunch of books, right? And like, what do they mean? Nobody knows, man. They have narratives, they have genres, they have themes. Of course, it's all in there. But like, chances are you as a person in 2021, you're not going to just pick up the Bible and kind of figure it out for yourself. So like, you have to kind of bring whatever you have to it. And I don't know, the Holy Spirit will figure out the rest, I suppose. But it's just like, I guess I don't want to like, maybe this is too heavy-handed of a metaphor, but like, the Bible says something, right? There are real themes in the Bible, and they do really exist, right? And like, people can do all kinds of things with them, though, is sort of the problem. Like, the Bible is like a very it's like a Swiss Army knife, I guess, maybe is like what it is, but not in the useful way. It's a Swiss Army knife that people keep trying to use wrongly.
Yeah.
Or people keep trying to like jam it in different places that it's not supposed to go. But like, that's just the way that people are gonna that's just what you're gonna do with it, right? So it's like the Bible, like, I guess, like probably all texts, it's a type of technology that you can make do a lot of different things. And like, it doesn't mean that you should, but you definitely can, and people do. And I guess that's part of the problem for me is figuring out like, yeah, I mean, like, exactly, like, what does that mean? And like, what's the responsibility of people who are socialists? Like, should we be doing this with the Bible in the first place? Is it worth it? And I guess it's hard to step away from it at this point, but yeah, so there it is. The Bible is a Swiss Army knife that people are using in the weirdest ways.
Yeah. I think let me put something on the table and we'll just see whether or not this lands. But I want to go back to the point you made earlier about having a materialist understanding of Christianity, because I think that's really the key here too, which is to say, what do these things do in the world? You can do the same thing with the Bible, right? What does it do? What's its material history? What are the consequences of it? And I think when you do that, what is especially fascinating to me is you don't actually get one straightforward story. It just is not the case that like the Bible makes liberation happen or it makes oppression happen. It makes these two things happen at the same time in a lot of cases. Like, again, thinking materially, you might think of like Nat Turner or John Brown, right? These Christian revolutionaries who thought that because of their Christianity that there shouldn't be slavery. But of course, the people that they were fighting were all slaveholders who went to church every Sunday, right? So there's something really important about that both of these people are holding the same book. Their worlds can't even really make sense without that book, but those worlds are also incommensurable. Like, they can't... in one of them, slavery continues, and in the other one, it is abolished. So I think, like, it's important, too, to kind of say, well, what that means, at least to me, is I don't really want to find out what Christianity sort of is, in an ultimate sense, which you can probably spend your entire life kind of, I don't know, trying to sort out in a perfect way. But I do want to figure out, like, what Christianity can be and has been, and sort of what can be done with Christianity. Marx has that line about I forget what it is now, but something about how what people make, they can remake or make differently. You know, that's the lesson of materialism, that all these structures are made up so we could just remake them. I feel the same way about Christianity as a thing. It's like it has a material history, which is to say it's plastic and malleable, and we have to be able to kind of make decisions that point it in a particular direction, even while it's also, you know, changing us and doing things with us that we may or may not like in the process.
Yeah, totally. Well, we're kind of getting close to the end here, maybe. But let's talk about this really quickly because I think it's a really important point. So, if I do say so myself, I think what we're saying here, sort of analytically, is right.
Of course,
I'm going to double down
obviously.
and say, yeah, of course, of course. I think what we're saying here is right. The problem is, though, it is a difficult way to talk.
Yeah.
Right? Like the analytics are super difficult because it's not compelling to anybody, right? Because like Reverend Barber can go up on a stage, even with Pete Buttigieg, it doesn't matter. And he can be like, well, listen, if you don't give a shit about poor people or people who are sick, you're a heretic. That's powerful. Like that's a powerful move to do rhetorically. And it rules too, right? Like it's great to call your political opponents like heretics or just like kind of chastise them for not doing like the Christian thing. It is a powerful thing to do. It's like it's something that really only pastors can get away with too, I think. But it is a difficult thing to square though with the analysis because of the bigger problems we've kind of laid out already. But what we're left with is like, well, on the one hand, there's this like very effective rhetorical tool that might mobilize people. It might be good for organizing. It might be good for I don't know, like convicting people. But like lack a little bit of the analytic thing that is very important, right? Like that we're talking about here. On the other hand, you know, the analytic has no rhetorical flair. It's just two guys on a podcast kind of bumping through it. So like, I don't really know what to do with that. Cause like on the one hand, I'm you know, like Reverend Barber's is like going to get things done and ours are just going to like maybe understand something. And that makes me feel very confused. Yeah.
No, I feel that way too. I mean, that's a great tension in my personal life. I feel trying to figure out well, it's no secret to people in this podcast. You know, I show up in a lot of communist circles. I spend a lot of time with communist people. And I think I have a reputation as being the Christian one who is around. And, you know, every once in a while someone does ask you, why do you bother? You know, and it is hard to sort of give an answer to that question that doesn't have 1,000 footnotes, you know. And it's like, at the end of the day, to make the conversation short, usually what I'll say is something like, you know, I was born in this tradition. I think there's something really compelling about it. It has a whole hold on me. I'm inspired by liberation theology and so on. But at the end of the day, I really feel like I'm a Christian because I do sort of believe it in an important way. And so I'm trying to sort of make my life conform to that, right? Like, I think it's okay to admit that in a conversation with an individual, but it's also so subjective or relative too, because you know, I live in a really multicultural city, and sometimes I meet people who are either they don't come from a Christian background or they're like severely harmed by it. And in those kinds of situations, the last thing you want to do is be like, well, that's just because those people weren't real Christians. If they were, you know, your country wouldn't have been bombed, or like you as a person wouldn't have been abused and so on. It's like, well, I don't know. All I can really say is like, yeah, I hate that Christians did that. And as a Christian person, you know, all I can do is try to sort of fight back against that from inside, to recognize the struggle and own it. So again, it's like, I think there's something actually pretty rhetorically compelling in that sense about being willing to own up to the complexity of it and just being like, yes, I get that it is messed up and I'm here to mess it up in the right way, I guess.
Yeah, I think so too. There can't, I guess, if we were just more eloquent speakers, if we were just a little bit more invested in the rhetoric ourselves, we'd be doing better. Yeah, if we were pastors. Yeah, it's true. Well, I guess that, there's calling it attention is probably right. You know, there's room for, I think, both these types of things in doing politics and Christianity. Like the sort of prophetic voice and calling people out is really powerful. It's not a tool I would want any pastor to give up, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, okay, some pastors definitely give it up, but like the good ones don't. Like, I don't know, if pastors have a tendency to go out on strike lines or whatever. I don't want them to like come out there with some like some weak ass analytical bullshit.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
no, call the boss a bad guy. Get over it with.
Yeah, 100%. I think that it's a time and a place thing, maybe, or maybe a strategy question or something. But it's always hard to parse out what's politically meaningful and what is analytically meaningful and what's personally meaningful too, right? You can kind of evacuate your own Christianity, I think, if you lean into this too hard. And I do think that's like a hazard of thinking about that. And I don't know, I'll just be honest. I want to be a Christian person. I think that's fine. I'll be a Christian for the rest of my life, for better or for worse. And I'll figure out what to do with it at the very end, I guess. But, all that to say, I do think that like it's important to recognize too that not sometimes like all those questions don't really come together in one single answer. Like what's really personally meaningful to me and helps my own spirituality or whatever is not usually the same thing as like what I find analytically true or useful. And typically neither of those things are the kinds of things I'm bringing to, I don't know, a rally or something. So I don't know. I think it's okay to sort of recognize that we don't have to sort of buy the evangelical lie that every single part of your life is actually like subsumed in this one singular, uncomplicated Christian identity or something.
Yeah, maybe that's what we're still working out here. I don't know.
This is like kind of, we just have a few minutes, so I'll say it. This is like a little off the path, but I always think about this rally I went to several years ago in Toronto. It was like a water protector rally. So Indigenous led, really foregrounding the role of Indigenous spirituality in this kind of political rally against a pipeline at the time. And the rally was so fascinating because, like I said, there's this kind of foregrounding of Indigenous spirituality, but then there was also a woman from a Muslim community who spoke about her faith and why she was there. There was a woman from a Jewish community who came and spoke about her faith and why she was there. And I think there were like a couple of other religious representatives, but there were actually no Christians who got up on the stage except this one guy who was there as a union person. And he got up and he was like, yeah, I'm here from the union. I'm really happy to see all this faith-based stuff. Like, I happen to be a Christian. Anyway, like, here's what unions think. And I thought, like, that was actually the best possible way for a Christian to engage this because Christians probably are the last people who should be like up on a stage at a rally to like talk about a problem that is basically created by Christians, like the destruction of the planet and the genocide of Indigenous people. So, I think there's something about that too, that like sometimes it's politically advantageous as well to sort of recognize that your Christianity doesn't have to be the, I don't know. It matters in a way to make it more absent or less present in a way that's very, very different from, I don't know, a Muslim person saying that they're there for, the reasons of their faith tradition in Canada or something. Anyway, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that, but it's just kind of like an anecdote that sticks out in my brain a lot about kind of identifying Christianity in these weird spaces.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Well, it's just like it is a good example though of like, the time where the analytic makes more sense, right? It makes more sense than like fiery rhetoric, where like I guess maybe the powers at play in that given situation when to minimize yourself, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, well, we've done it again. We did another episode that we didn't script out. It's been a long time. We didn't have a guest on, and I don't know. We'll have to see when you listen back to this, dear listener. Tell us if it's rusty. Tell us if we should go back to planning out every beat of the argument that we can talk through together, or if this fireside chat vibe is something that we should lean into, because it does feel good to do less prep, I have to admit, but I don't know if we actually get anything done. We'll have to find out.
Yeah, we said some things for sure.
Yeah, no one can fault us for that.
We've opened up a whole new plateau, a new line of questioning, and I think that you got to appreciate that.
Yeah, don't worry. We'll go back to talking about Cuba probably next week.
I hope so.
All right. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, like we said at the top of the show, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. You can find us on social media. You can send us an email at themagnificast@gmail.com. Our music is by Amoria Armstrong, and our outro is by the Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have